Why do Canadians go ballistic in war? Ah, Canadians. We all know the stereotype. Nice, friendly, and extremely apologetic. If you're fighting them, though, avoid them at all costs, because for some strange reason, these usually calm maple leaf lovers go absolutely ballistic when there's a war on. Trench raids. In World War I, the only thing scarier than going on a trench raid was to be on the receiving end of a Canadian one. Soon after their deployment, the Canucks earned a fearsome reputation as enthusiastic and innovative practitioners of this brutal art. To maximize stealth, they were known to blacken their faces and to wear thick rubber gloves. They also brought along with them a variety of handmade weapons to optimize their killing effectiveness, such as spiked clubs, knives, and brass knuckles, to allow them to take out enemies silently. Alternatively, pipe bombs and grenade catapults were used if they preferred to go in guns blazing. On operation, the Canadians tore through trenches so quickly and with such cold-blooded efficiency that by the end of the war, they were able to reach up to 1 kilometer behind enemy lines. Their speed and ferocity earned them the nicknames from the terrified Germans ranging from stormtroopers to wild colonials. The savage determination of the Canadians was most on show in the 4 months leading up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where they conducted 55 raids. The most disastrous of these happened in March of 1917, involving over 1,300 soldiers. Despite suffering an appalling 43% casualty rate and being constantly gassed, one group of raiders was able to clear a 450-meter section of the German trench. Killing prisoners of war. When they weren't going on deadly nighttime raids, the Canadians could usually be found slaughtering prisoners of war. Shockingly, in World War I, the murder of German POWs was actively encouraged by some commanders. Before the attack on Vimy Ridge, for instance, one soldier recalled how an officer told him, "Remember, no prisoners, they'll just eat your rations." Having to share already limited food supplies was just one of the reasons why most preferred to shoot rather than capture, but the most powerful justifications were revenge and battle rage. In a typical account, one lieutenant would recall how, after losing half of his company to machine gun fire, his surviving men rushed to the battery that had caused the damage to find the Germans inside crying and with their hands up. Unmoved, they proceeded to mercilessly bludgeon and shoot them to death. Another would relate on one occasion, a German rushed to one of his comrades with a bayonet, but then chickened out and surrendered. In his own words, "Our boy would have none of it. He lunged at the German again and again, who each time lowered his arms and stopped the point of the bayonet with his bare hands. The German was screaming for mercy." Even if a surrendering German somehow survived his initial encounter with a wild colonial, his life was still in great danger. In this regard, one veteran would remember how he once witnessed one of his fellow Canadians turn a German POW into red mist by dropping a live grenade into his greatcoat pocket. Live and let die. During World War I, soldiers carried out an unofficial live and let live policy. This was an unspoken agreement in which both sides agreed to only attack each other if ordered. The most famous example of this in action was the unofficial 1914 Christmas Day truce, in which thousands of combatants from both sides exchanged gifts, sang carols, and mingled with each other for a few hours. The next year, though, the Canucks were on the front lines, and unlike their allies, live and let live was not in their vocabulary. Among their number were the troops of the 3rd Battalion, who were stationed in the Ypres salient on the Western Front. In the spirit of the previous year, voices from the opposing trench wished them a happy Christmas, and some of the friendlier Canucks returned the greetings. After a couple of minutes, men from both sides had raised their heads above the dugouts, and an older, whiskered man was invitingly waving a box of cigars. Moments later, a Canadian sergeant ruined Christmas by dispatching 2 Germans with his machine gun. Of course, this wouldn't be the last time the Germans of the Great War were tricked into a false sense of security by their heartless North American foe. In one particularly cruel episode, Canuck troops tossed tins of corned beef into a German trench. Then, when they heard their requests for more, they lobbed grenades at them instead. As the stories so far have illustrated, for some reason, Canadians went absolutely bananas in World War I. But why were they so angry? Some historians have argued their ruthlessness was an emotional response to a battlefield rumor about the so-called crucified Canadian, an officer who was supposedly crucified to a barn door near Ypres. Others have speculated their thirst for revenge drew from their traumatic experience at the harrowing 1915 Second Battle of Ypres, during which Canadians took the brunt of the first ever German poison gas attack of the war. The best explanation, however, may be the simple fact that Canadians were brutalized more than any others because they were always being placed in the first wave of attacks. Juno Beach. By the close of the Great War, the Canadians had gone from a relatively unknown fighting force to one of the planet's most feared and respected military outfits. It was with this hard-earned reputation that they would enter the killing fields of World War II to face off against a German army reinforced by elite units with a strangely familiar name, Stormtroopers. On June 6, 1944, the Canadians reminded everyone of their elite status when they pulled off what's considered one of the most tactically successful operations of D-Day. Their objective was to storm Juno Beach and then seize the cities of Kane and Bayeux with 14,000 soldiers and 1,000 paratroopers. During the first wave, 3,000 lion-hearted Canadians rushed towards German pillboxes, taking heavy casualties. They were then followed in by tanks, which obliterated most of the German beach defenses, allowing infantrymen to swarm in and begin close-quarters fighting. Impressively, it took them less than 2 hours to secure their first route off the beach at the small town of Courcelles. By the end of the day, Courcelles-sur-Mer, Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, and Colombiers-sur-Soleil had all fallen, and the tank regiment of the 1st Hussars were at the Caen-Bayeux highway intersection, making them the only Allied unit on D-Day to actually reach their final objective. The Devil's Brigade. In World War II, the Canadians distinguished themselves not only as dependable infantrymen, but also as skilled commandos in a joint American-Canadian unit called the 1st Special Service Force, better known as the Devil's Brigade, or the Black Devils. The Devil's Brigade was formed in June 1942 and had only accepted individuals into its ranks who were already well acquainted with survival and the outdoors. As a result, former skiers, parachutists, hunters, lumberjacks, trappers, and game wardens made up the majority of its personnel. These hard and rugged men were transformed into killing machines via a brutal training regime that involved 100-mile speed marches and specialist training with all sorts of weapons, explosives, and vehicles. To strike fear into their enemies' hearts on the battlefield, they placed a calling card on the dead, emblazoned with the phrase, "The worst is yet to come," in German. The Black Devils were assigned the most dangerous assignments, with one of their most iconic missions taking place in December of 1943 at the mountain peak of Monte la Defensa, southeast of Rome. For about a month, multiple British, Canadian, and American assaults attempting to dislodge the Germans at the top had been wiped out one after the other. By the time the Devil's Brigade arrived on the scene, Monte la Defensa had been battered with over 200,000 shells, earning it the nickname the $1 Million Hill. At 1:30 a.m. on December 3rd, carrying 60-pound rucksacks as well as knives, guns, and bayonets, and with charcoal-blackened faces, 600 men of the 1st Special Service Force began climbing up the near-vertical cliff face as fog and swirling snow enveloped the mountain. A little before 6 a.m., they reached the summit and began quietly slitting the throats of sentries. Then, all of a sudden, a rock slide gave away their position and the enemy opened fire. The fighting was intense and both sides suffered heavy losses, but the battle-hardened Germans were eventually expelled. In a mere 2 hours, the month-long standoff had been ended by a force that was 10 times smaller than the combined Allied force that had up until then failed to take Monte la Defensa. With a little help from the Americans, they had shown that once again, that to mess with a Canadian in wartime is to sign your own death warrant. Why were the Japanese so brutal in World War II? Japan is known as the land of anime, sushi, and sumo. Today, when outsiders think of Japan, the first thoughts that come to mind are probably Godzilla, impeccable politeness, and technological innovation. In the last century, however, there was a different, far darker reputation garnered by the land of the rising sun. What caused this infamous reputation for cruelty? Bushido. The explanation has its roots that go back for centuries. Japan was a patchwork of feudal states which were in a near constant state of war, reaching its height during the Sengoku Jidai period, which began in the mid-15th century, ending in 1603 with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. With the endless fighting, tremendous cultural emphasis was placed on the warrior class, the samurai. During the stability of the Tokugawa shogunate, this cultural attitude was formalized into a warrior's moral code of conduct called Bushido, which means way of the warrior. Bushido changed in its tenets over the centuries, but some of the main principles, such as self-sacrifice, reckless bravery in the face of the enemy, and unquestioning loyalty to one's daimyo, or lord, never changed. The age of the samurai ended after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. The once strict social classes of the previous eras were eliminated, and Japan underwent rapid industrialization after centuries of isolation. Bushido was readopted for the modern age, with Emperor Hirohito and his military officers being substituted for the shogun and daimyo, its teachings dominating actions before and during the Second World War. Japan began to modernize rapidly, using Western industrial, technological, and military innovations, and the Bushido Code was adapted to fit into the modern landscape. In the years before the outbreak of war, the Japanese school system had fully embraced the regimented militarism of Bushido. Students were indoctrinated into a system of unrelenting discipline that emphasized obedience to authority as the highest of virtues. This would be enforced by cruel methods, such as being beaten by their teachers, struck with canes or wooden swords, being forced to run laps until dropping from exhaustion, or hold heavy objects on outstretched hands, and whatever else their instructors could come up with. This type of indoctrination led to a generation who had unflinching loyalty to their emperor and their superiors, and they would obey without question. No retreat, no surrender. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of Japanese culture during this time was the willingness to fight to the bitter end. According to their view on warfare, surrendering was an unbearable disgrace, a mark of shame for any fighting man. When other armies would see the futility of fighting and give up, the Japanese military would keep fighting, regardless of the casualties. For comparison, for every Allied soldier taken captive in World War II, 3 would be killed on the battlefield, while the Japanese military would suffer 120 dead for every one of its soldiers taken captive. Often, they would resort to banzai charges, hurling themselves at the enemy rather than surrender. This was named after their battle cry, Tennoheika Banzai, roughly translated as "Long live the Emperor." One of the most famous banzai charges happened on July 6, 1944 on Saipan. After 3 weeks of battle, the Americans had captured much of the island and were closing the noose on the remaining Japanese defenders. Rather than surrender, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu, the commanding officer, committed seppuku, or ritual suicide, in the face of his failure, another samurai tradition. The remaining men and officers, as well as many civilians, then threw themselves with reckless abandon at the American lines, hoping to kill as many soldiers before being killed in the fierce fighting that ensued, much of it in desperate hand-to-hand combat. For the next 12 hours, they rampaged around the island, overrunning several American positions before the bitter end. It was estimated that around 4,300 Japanese soldiers died this way rather than surrender, the largest banzai attack of the war. They weren't alone in their fanatical defiance. Hundreds of civilians threw themselves off of cliff sides rather than allow themselves to be captured by the horrified Americans. While this was the largest banzai attack of the war, they would be repeated over and over again during the island hopping campaign. any survivors committing seppuku, preferring death to capture. Many Japanese soldiers would also fake surrendering, then drop a grenade or pull a pistol on American soldiers that had dropped their guard. After several of these incidents, the Americans, for the most part, stopped believing attempts at surrender, simply shooting the supposedly surrendering soldier rather than take the risk. The most extreme example of this attitude of never surrendering was the kamikaze, translated as divine wind. These were pilots who would deliberately crash their planes into enemy ships as a last-ditch, desperate attempt to halt their inexorable advance on the Japanese homeland. These pilots were sent on a one-way mission to damage as much enemy naval strength as possible. Kamikaze attacks reached their peak in 1945 at the Battle of Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. Swarms of these fanatical pilots struck the American fleet, killing over 5,000, the largest loss of life the U.S. Navy suffered in a single battle. Even with their Pacific Empire in ruins, the Japanese nation would not give in, even resorting to handing out bamboo spears to school children. During planning for the invasion, the American military was expecting to have to fight the majority of the population. In anticipation of Operation Downfall, estimates of potential Allied casualties reached as high as 1 million, and 500,000 Purple Hearts were produced, a number so high that these original medals are still being given out today. Don't get taken prisoner. Since the very concept of surrendering was inconceivable to the Japanese military mindset, they had nothing but contempt for enemy combatants that laid down their weapons. These men had given up their honor, and in an honor-bound society, these made POWs the lowest of the low. Compounding this was Japan's attitude towards the Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of POWs. Japan did sign the convention, but failed to ratify it. As a result, they didn't abide by its tenets, with some officers derisively calling it the Coward's Code. So when Allied troops surrendered, such as when 80,000 British, Indian, Malaysian, and Australian soldiers gave up in 1942 at the fall of Singapore, they were taken aback. How could any self-respecting fighting man give up so easily? As they had no honor, the prisoners were treated as animals with little regard for their well-being. Forced to work at doing hard labor, they were deliberately starved, beaten, and executed for the slightest of infractions. They could be used for bayonet practice or decapitated with an officer's swords on a whim. Because of this treatment, the death rate among POWs was appallingly high. For comparison, the death rate for an Allied soldier in a German POW camp was about 1.2%. Those unfortunate enough to be taken by the Japanese suffered a death rate as high as 37%. The treatment of civilians. This blatant disregard for human life also encompassed civilians as well. In addition to their form of Bushido, the Japanese also held deeply xenophobic views towards outsiders, especially the Chinese. As early as 1931, Japan began to encroach on Chinese territory, which erupted into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. In December of that year, the Japanese army captured the city of Nanking. During the next 2 months, the population was systematically subject to one of the most brutal sackings in history. Estimates vary, but between 100 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed, with countless incidents of torture, assault, and murders committed. At one point, a pair of Japanese officers competed with one another to see who could decapitate 100 Chinese the fastest, though they exceeded this number by murdering 106 and 105 respectively. By far, the most horrifying aspect of this disregard for human life was Unit 731, short for Manchu Detachment 731, a chemical and biological warfare research team. This unit of the Imperial Japanese Army performed experiments on captive prisoners, mostly Chinese and Korean subjects. The prisoners would be infected with various diseases to document the disease's progress. Limbs would be hacked off and organs would be removed while the victim was still alive, to determine the progress of the disease still in living tissue. Weapons would also be tested on living subjects, including guns, knives, bayonets, explosives like grenades, flamethrowers, and anything else in the Japanese arsenal would be used on the captives. The effectiveness jotted down for study. The These are just a few of the horrors that Unit 731 inflicted on the defenseless. After the war, the Japanese government and people distanced themselves as much as possible from the fanaticism of the mid-20th century. With pacifism written into their constitution, Japanese culture has shifted, now focusing much more on technological advancement and connection with the outside world. A 180-degree change from their past. Don't underestimate the French military. Any discussion of a nation's reputation in warfare will almost inevitably lead to derogatory remarks directed towards the French. Their military exploits are the punchline of countless jokes, memes, and other disparaging comments, lampooning them as cowards or inept on the battlefield. The reality, however, is much different. Throughout its long history, the French nation has had an extensive and distinguished record of military triumphs, dating back as far as the early Middle Ages. In actual fact, for millennia, French soldiers have fought and died with courage, skill, and distinction. The story of French military history begins in the wake of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Franks, a Germanic tribe from further east, pushed westward into what is now France. And under the reign of King Clovis I, the land in the Pyrenees in the southwest, the Alps in the southeast, and the Rhine River in the east was also secured. Though these borders would shift countless times over the intervening centuries, the rough area of French territory had been established. Clovis's descendant, Charles Martel, played an integral role in world history. In 732 AD, he and his Frankish army prevented the Arabo-Umayyad dynasty advance into France, inflicting a crushing defeat on their enemies at the Battle of Tours. With this victory, the ever-rising tide of Islamic expansion into Europe was halted. Throughout the Middle Ages, French forces fought in numerous wars against other European powers. Most extensive campaigns were against the English. During a series of conflicts now known as the 100 Years' War, the French would suffer significant defeats at several battles, including Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, and would later see much of their land devastated by English raids. In spite of these setbacks, the latter portion of the conflict saw the French drive the English from their lands on the continent. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern era, the French army, under the reign of Louis XIV, became the largest and most powerful in Europe, almost 400,000 strong. This force pioneered many advancements in military innovation, including logistical and support systems, field hospitals, and the introduction of standardized uniforms to its soldiers. The French military record during the early modern era is mixed, with both victories and defeats, but no more so than any other contemporary nation. It was during the late 18th and early 19th centuries when the French reached their zenith of military strength. Under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, French armies marched across Europe, smashing rival powers at the decisive battles such as Marengo and Austerlitz. Defeats were caused by weather and logistical issues, such as the campaign against Russia in 1812, or by superior enemy tactics, such as Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. During this time, the abilities or courage of the individual French soldier was never in doubt. A century later, French soldiers found themselves embroiled in one of their most tragic military campaigns. The First World War introduced mass slaughter on an industrial scale, and France found itself in the middle of the conflict, with the majority of the fighting on the Western Front taking place on French soil. Vast areas of the French countryside were transformed into a shell-cratered hellscape, one in which millions of men were trapped for years. During this tumultuous time, French soldiers bore the brunt of the carnage, suffering titanic casualties. In the first 2 months of the war, over 300,000 French were killed, a number that would swell to 500,000 by the end of 1914. There was no battle as bloody, or one which exemplified the tenacity and courage of France's military, than the Battle of Verdun. In 1916, German General Erich von Falkenhayn launched an offensive aimed at the city of Verdun. Allowing such a strategically and symbolically important location to fall into enemy hands was unacceptable to French high command, and under the direction of Marshal Philippe Pétain, Verdun was reinforced. Their battle cry at the onset of this fight was "On ne passe pas," or "They shall not pass." The battle devolved into a grinding stalemate, with both sides dug in, stubbornly refusing to surrender. Over 40 million artillery shells were fired during the fighting. By the end of the 303rd day, 162,000 French soldiers had lost their lives, with another 377,000 wounded, missing, or captured. True to their word, the French held their positions, and the Germans didn't pass those French positions. In the face of these and other monumental losses, the French military did in fact mutiny during the First World War. Strangely enough, however, they didn't lay down their arms. These men stayed in their trenches and continued to resist the Germans, but refused to participate in futile attacks against the heavily entrenched enemy positions. In the words of one group of mutineers, "You have nothing to fear. We are prepared to man the trenches. We will do our duty, and the Germans will not get through. But we will not take part in attacks which will result in nothing but useless casualties." Even when mutineering, French soldiers were still willing to lay down their lives for their nation. By the end of the war, over 1.5 million Frenchmen lay dead, with millions more wounded, though estimates vary. Roughly 18% of those who served in the ranks were killed, effectively wiping out a generation of young men. Yet in spite of these catastrophic losses, they still held firm against repeated enemy offensives. It was a generation later that France would earn its reputation as an inept military power, but this is far from the truth. After the outbreak of the Second World War, France and Britain declared war on Germany. After finishing off Poland, the Wehrmacht turned its attention west, breaking through the Low Countries and driving into France to circumvent the Maginot Line, a formidable series of defenses that ended at the Belgian border. The oversight by French High Command, as well as advances in fast-moving maneuver warfare, caught the Allies off guard, and France was overrun in 6 weeks, an astonishing feat by any military standard. It was due to this fast capitulation that France gained an undeserved reputation as a nation of cowards with an incompetent military. This, however, is not a fair assessment. Other powers struggled against the German war machine, but had other advantages that France lacked. France didn't have the protection of the high seas enjoyed by Britain or the vast landmass of the Soviet Union, and were overrun in short order. Even when defeated, the French people still fought on, both in exile and as partisans. The French resistance played a vital role in frustrating German plans on the Western Front. Their sabotage, assassination, and intelligence-gathering operations were a key component in the success of the D-Day landings in 1944. To this day, the French resistance is seen as the symbolic representation of all resistance movements. After the Second World War, France was involved in many conflicts around the world, particularly in former colonies such as Indochina and Algeria. During the global war on terror, the French military provided support in the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan. In addition, French air power effectively enforced no-fly zones over Libya, which allowed rebels to overthrow the dictator Muammar Gaddafi. French forces have also been at the forefront of anti-terror operations in other parts of Africa. They are currently the only NATO nation to participate in Operation Barkhane, which combated militants in West Africa. Currently, around 3,000 French soldiers are stationed in Chad, the Ivory Coast, Mali, and other nations. One of the reasons for France's poor reputation can be attributed to their methods in these low-intensity conflicts. While most other nations use a more flashy shock and awe approach to combating terrorism and insurgency, France employs a more subtle strategy. In 2007, in order to stop an incursion of rebel forces in the Central African Republic, France sent 2 waves of paratroopers and a single fighter jet to halt the advance. No more than a few dozen were involved, and the French press didn't pick up the story until weeks after. It's this precision approach that lacks the same fanfare of other nations, which helps contribute to the popular conception of France as lacking military ability. Throughout the long history of their nation, the French have had military successes and failures, but no more or less than any other nations. Their reputation as a nation of cowards who surrender at the slightest provocation is not only unfounded, but based on biases and misconceptions that don't take into account the countless acts of bravery and martial success of the French people. What would you do if 1,600 heavily armed soldiers surrounded your position? Most of us would wave the white flag faster than you can say, "I surrender." But for the legendary Gurkha warriors of Nepal, surrender isn't in their vocabulary. In this video, we're diving into the extraordinary story of the Gurkhas, the mountain warriors so formidable that even their enemies sometimes stop shooting at them just to applaud their bravery. No, seriously, that actually happened. The year was 1814. The British Empire, having gobbled up huge chunks of India like an imperial Pac-Man, have turned its hungry eyes towards the mountain kingdom of Nepal. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, only that they were about to face warriors who treated death like most of us treat a minor inconvenience. The Battle of Nalapani would prove just how seriously the Gurkhas took their job. Perched in a hill fort 600 feet up, a mere 600 Gurkhas faced off against 1,600 British troops. The math wasn't in their favor, but apparently nobody told them that. For over a month, this small force held their ground. By the end of the first assault in late October, 35 British soldiers were dead and 228 wounded, taken down by Nepalese bows, matchlock weapons, and, wait for it, stones thrown by women and children. That's right, even Gurkha civilians were giving the British Empire a headache. As British artillery slowly picked them off, the Gurkhas still refused to surrender. When the fortress finally fell in November, of the original 600 defenders, only 68 remained. Some had even managed to escape despite being completely surrounded, probably just to prove they could. The British, who normally responded to resistance by doubling down on conquest, did something unusual. They started recruiting these fearsome fighters into their own army. It was the military equivalent of saying, if you can't beat them, hire them. And it's a practice that continues to this day. Gulbir Thapa, the man the enemy applauded. Born around 1888 in the tiny Himalayan village of Nigalpani, Gulbir Thapa found himself at the Battle of Loos in France in September 1915. There, his unit of the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Gurkha Rifles, had the delightful task of clearing German trenches while wearing gas masks. Not exactly optimal fighting conditions. By the end of their push, Thapa was injured and the last man standing from his group. Most of us would consider this a good time to call it a day, but Thapa spotted a wounded British soldier from the 2nd Leicestershire Regiment. Despite the soldier's pleas to leave him behind, which would have been the sensible thing to do, Thapa stayed with him all day and night. When morning came, he used the mist as cover to carry the man to safety. Then, as if it wasn't enough, he went back and rescued 2 more Nepalese soldiers. But wait, there's more. For his grand finale, Thapa returned for the original wounded soldier in broad daylight. As he zigzagged across no man's land, German machine gunners targeted him, but somehow every shot missed. At one point, and this is completely true, the German soldiers were so impressed, they stopped firing and broke into applause. Yeah, that's right. In the middle of one of history's bloodiest conflicts, Thapa's bravery was so remarkable that even the enemy took a moment to appreciate it. He became the first Nepalese soldier to receive the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. Bhanubhakta Gurung, a one-man army. Fast forward to March 5th, 1945. Rifleman Bhanubhakta Gurung and the 2nd Gurkha Rifles were approaching a Japanese position in Burma when they were pinned down by machine gun fire. Then a sniper started picking them off from a tree 75 yards away. Most people's reaction would be to get lower and to the ground, perhaps dig a hole with their bare hands. Not Gurung. He simply stood up, as casual as if he were ordering coffee, and shot the sniper dead. With the squad able to advance to within 20 yards of their objective, they discovered at least 5 enemy foxholes blocking their path. Gurung apparently decided that this was taking too long, sprang forward through a hailstorm of bullets. What followed was essentially the 1940s equivalent of a video game boss run. Foxhole number 1, 2 grenades, enemies neutralized. Foxhole number 2, 1 bayonet charge, enemy dispatched. Foxholes number 3 and number 4, more bayonet work and grenades, while being shot at from point-blank range. But the final boss, a light machine gun position with 3 soldiers, remained. Having used all his fragmentation grenades, Gurung improvised with smoke grenades. When 2 blinded Japanese soldiers ran out clutching their eyes, He introduced them to his kukri knife, the curved blade that's as iconic to the Gurkhas as a lightsaber is to a Jedi. For the third soldier, Gurung crawled back into the bunker, snuck up behind him, and ended the threat. Then, anticipating a counterattack, he and his men held the position and repulsed the enemy response. For turning what should have been a squad effort into a one-man show, Gurung received the Victoria Cross. Lachiman Gurung, the one-armed defender. If you thought that was impressive, meet Lachiman Gurung of the 8th Gurkha Rifles. In the early morning of May 13, 1945, Gurung was manning a lookout position near the Irrawaddy River in Burma when Japanese soldiers decided to play, "Let's throw grenades at the Gurkha." The first grenade landed on the rim of his trench. Gurung threw it back like he was returning an unwanted package. A second one landed inside his trench. He tossed that one away too. When a third grenade appeared, he grabbed it, but this time it exploded in his hand. In an instant, his fingers were blown off, his right arm was shattered, and his face, body, and right leg were severely wounded. His two comrades lay badly injured. Most soldiers would consider this a medical emergency. Gurung saw it as a minor setback. With only his left arm functioning, he somehow managed to load and fire his rifle one-handed as Japanese troops rushed his position. For the next 4 hours, he repelled wave after wave of attackers while shouting, "Come and fight a Gurkha!" which is probably the last invitation you'd want to accept. By dawn, 31 Japanese corpses lay in front of his position. His one-man defense had prevented the enemy from breaking through the entire line. For this almost superhuman feat, he too was awarded the Victoria Cross. Diprasad Pun, the modern Gurkha legend. Do you think these stories are just relics of a bygone era? Meet Acting Sergeant Diprasad Pun of the 1st Battalion Royal Gurkha Rifles. On September 17, 2010, Pun was on watch at a compound in Afghanistan when he heard a noise that he initially thought was a cow. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a cow. It was Taliban fighters setting up an IED at the compound gate. What followed was 17 minutes of pure action movie material. Except this was real life. Alone in the pitch black, Pun fired 250 machine gun rounds, emptied 6 magazines from his rifle, and hurled 17 grenades and a claymore mine at approximately 15 attackers coming from multiple directions. When they got too close for conventional weapons, he beat them away with the machine gun tripod. At one point, he even dropped a sandbag on the head of an enemy climbing up to his position, like a deadly version of Home Alone. Throughout the fight, he motivated himself by shouting, "Marchi Talai," Nepalese for "I'll kill you," which in the circumstances was less a threat and more of a spoiler alert for the Taliban. When the dust settled, 3 attackers were dead and the rest had fled. A wise decision when facing a Gurkha. Pun was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, Britain's 2nd highest combat honor. From the mountains of Nepal to battlefields across the world, the Gurkhas have built a reputation as some of the most formidable warriors on the planet. Their motto might as well be death before surrender, but preferably the enemy's death. What makes these stories even more remarkable is that these weren't superhuman giants. Most Gurkhas stand around 5'3" to 5'7", or 1.6 to 1.7 meters tall. What they lack in height, they make up for with courage that seems to defy human instinct. Today, Gurkhas continue to serve in the British Army and the Indian Army, maintaining their legendary status. The rigorous selection process to become a Gurkha remains one of the toughest in the world, with thousands of young Nepalese men competing for just a few hundred positions each year. So the next time you're faced with overwhelming odds, remember the Gurkha way. Stand your ground, face the enemy, and if all else fails, maybe drop a sandbag on their head. When nations go to war, they employ all manner of doctrines that are believed to be the most efficient ways to ensure victory. Whether based on economic, geographic, cultural, or other factors, many nations' methods for fighting wars have become well known and almost stereotypical. Whether completely accurate or based on misconceptions, here are some ways that nations fight their wars. The United States. When one imagines the United States going to war, thoughts immediately turn to high-tech military hardware, bringing copious amounts of firepower to bear against an overwhelmed enemy that has little chance against the onslaught. But is this true? Well, in short, yes. In the 20th century, the U.S. has taken a much more active role in world affairs, and as a consequence has expended tremendous effort towards its military. As of 2023, the Americans spent $877 billion per year, more than the next 10 nations combined. This, along with extensive technological development, means that American forces have access to some of the most technologically advanced military hardware in the world. While not the largest in numerical terms, the U.S. military can bring more firepower to bear at any given moment than any other nation. U.S. doctrine relies on power projection, the ability to fight sustained conflicts well outside the nation's borders. The centerpiece of this strategy is the large fleet of aircraft carriers. Of the 21 currently active aircraft carriers, 11 belong to the U.S. Navy, with the next nations with 2 each. On a modern battlefield, arguably the most decisive element is air superiority. In order to control the skies, the United States has access to a large number of aircraft, including strategic bombers, fifth-generation fighters, close air support to aid troops on the ground, cargo planes, reconnaissance and surveillance craft, among many others. Because of this, there's an anecdote saying that the world's largest air force is the U.S. Air Force, and the second largest is the U.S. Navy. This isn't exactly true, however. The largest air force is in fact the U.S. Air Force. The second largest is the U.S. Army Aviation. The third largest is the Russian Air Force, with the U.S. Navy relegated to 4th place. The 7th place spot goes to the U.S. Marine Corps. In total, the American military can deploy over 13,000 aircraft, with the closest rival, the Russian Air Force, consisting of a bit over 4,000. In addition, the U.S. has over 750 military bases in 80 countries around the world, meaning American troops can respond to crises anywhere in just a few days. In recent decades, more and more emphasis has been placed on the use of unmanned drones, which enable the American military to engage foes from hundreds or even thousands of miles away, a testament to the technological edge the U.S. has over many opponents. The key to American force projection is industry and logistics. Because the U.S. is geographically isolated from many hotspots around the world, extensive logistic chains have been developed. Currently, the overwhelming majority of the military are involved in logistics and support duties rather than frontline service. Wherever Americans are deployed, they will have the necessary food, ammunition, fuel, and whatever else they need to complete their mission. American military spending enables the ability to utilize what's been dubbed shock and awe, a term that was developed during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Foes are overwhelmed with immense firepower and cutting-edge hardware that's almost impossible to resist in a direct engagement. Wherever American soldiers are deployed, they will almost certainly have at their disposal some of the highest technological advancements available, backed up by an extensive logistics chain that far outstrips virtually any rival power. Germany. During both World Wars, Germany began the conflict using rapid advances, earning them a reputation for blitzkrieg, or lightning war, though they never used that term in any official context. In both cases, however, the initial successes gave way to Germany adopting a more defensive posture, digging in against Entente and Allied counteroffensives. During World War I, after the initial success of the Schlieffen Plan, the German army created an elaborate network of trenches, fortifying large stretches of the Western Front with layers of defenses. After suffering heavy casualties in the early portion of the war, the German High Command developed a layered defense in depth. Called elastic defense, the doctrine called for allowing the enemy to attack, steadily increasing the intensity of resistance until the enemy was overextended, and then launching a counterattack which drove back the enemy while minimizing German casualties. During the Second World War, the Germans constructed an elaborate network of fortifications in what were known as the Atlantic Wall along the Atlantic coast to repel any Allied seaborne invasion, and the Siegfried Line, which ran between the border of France and Germany. The linchpin of both designs were defensive bunkers, fixed emplacements designed to withstand virtually anything the enemy could throw at them. They were usually made from reinforced concrete, which could be several feet thick, with firing ports for machine guns, mortars, and other weaponry. They would be positioned in strategic locations, such as around towns and cities, advantageous locations around trench lines, and often on the reverse slope of a hill. This did limit the range of the bunker's weaponry, but the advantage of surprise made up for the loss of range. A particularly well-enforced bunker or pillbox could withstand a direct hit from heavy artillery, and in later years, aerial bombardment. These bunkers were so well made that on numerous occasions, enemy forces would bypass them during their advance, leaving the bunkers and pillboxes as islands of resistance in a sea of foes. German forces also made use of small one-man fortified positions known as Tobruks after the Libyan city, which was the site of an important siege in the Second World War. These concrete structures were circular, allowing the occupant a 360-degree field of fire with his weaponry, usually a machine gun. Some Tobruks were open-topped, but there were other single-man bunkers which were capped with tank turrets, giving the occupant much greater protection. While rapid-moving mechanized forces may have received the most attention, it was the extensive defensive positions that Germany employed that was a key component to Germany's overall military strategy. China. During the Korean War, UN troops drove back the North Koreans from their southern neighbors. As they advanced north, they encountered Chinese soldiers who threw themselves at the enemy in a tidal wave of bodies, overwhelming them in sheer weight of numbers. Is this accurate or a misunderstanding of Chinese tactics? As one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, China has a long history of warfare against both internal and external threats. The Art of War by Sun Tzu is widely regarded as one of the first military manuals in the world that could be traced back to the 5th century BCE. Other innovations in military development have their origins in China, especially gunpowder, which has had arguably more of an impact than any other invention. Today, China has the second largest military expenditure after the United States and has the largest military in the world in terms of number and is extensively trained in combined arms, utilizing infantry, armored forces, air power, naval forces, and special operations units, as well as a large reserve of nuclear weapons should the need arise. So where did the idea of massive waves of conscripts charging the enemy, throwing men at the enemy until they run out of ammunition come from? Well, for starters, China has a titanic population, and until early 2023, it was the most populated nation on the planet. With about 1/5 of the world's population living in China, there is a pre-existing perception that they have manpower to spare and are able to absorb casualties that would cripple other nations. The reputation of the Chinese forces using human wave tactics began during the Korean War. Chinese soldiers would mass against an enemy position and then attempt to overrun it with sheer weight of numbers. To those on the receiving end of such an assault, it seemed like endless waves of Chinese infantry were crashing towards them. In reality, Chinese tactics were much more sophisticated. Under the cover of darkness, infiltration teams would creep close to the enemy and at a prearranged signal, such as a bugle or a gong, they would surge forward in an attempt to overrun the position using shock and violence of action. Should the action fail, however, another infiltration team would make their attempt, repeating the process, though without the element of surprise. While this was going on, other forces would attempt to slip around the enemy and attack from the rear. Due to poor communications, this process can be repeated over and over again, regardless of casualties, giving those who face it the impression that they're being assaulted by waves of Chinese troops. This was exacerbated by journalists reporting on the war, who wanted to give the impression of American and other UN forces being overwhelmed by hordes of enemy soldiers. Those who actually faced such tactics knew differently, with American soldiers remarking sardonically, "How many hordes are there in a Chinese platoon?" Russia and the Soviet Union. Russia and the Soviet Union was and is the largest nation on the planet, with vast expanses of territory. It's also home to a large population compared to other European powers. To their foes, such as the French during the Napoleonic era, or the Germans in the 20th century, fighting Russia or the Soviet Union was a never-ending trek through hostile environments, facing waves after waves of stubborn defenders, being ground down over time in a never-ending war of attrition. But is this accurate? It is true that Russia is a titanic landmass, and invading the nation requires extensive logistics and marching over seemingly endless territory. In the words of Army Group South's commander Gerd von Rundstedt, "The vastness of Russia devours us." Compounding the environmental issues were the weather conditions, such as deep mud in the autumn that can stop armies in their tracks, and later the severe winters that crippled virtually all invaders. While dealing with these conditions, they would be subject to swarms of Russian or Soviet soldiers who would overwhelm them with human wave attacks and the weight of seemingly endless numbers. This last part is not exactly accurate, however. In spite of Russia's landmass, the vast majority of the population and infrastructure lives west of the Ural Mountains. Though impressive on a map, it is impossible to withdraw the entire population, as well as vital infrastructure, further east, though the Soviets did move many factories to these safer locations. During Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union faced a severe crisis, as Wehrmacht forces captured vast areas of territory, killing or capturing millions of Red Army soldiers. Joseph Stalin's infamous Order 227, nicknamed the Not One Step Back Order, issued in July 1942, demanded that Soviet forces stand their ground. To quote the order directly, "Every commander, every soldier and political officer has to realize that our resources are not infinite." Stalin then goes on to openly state that there is no way the Soviets could retreat endlessly, and that every bit of ground taken strengthens the enemy and weakens the Soviet war effort. The bulk of the text explains why it was so important that they stand their ground and not continue to retreat deeper into Soviet territory. On the battlefield, Soviet soldiers were believed to throw themselves at the enemy in massive human waves, often without weapons. This is a gross misunderstanding. The main Soviet doctrine is referred to as deep battle, which is similar to the German Blitzkrieg, using massed frontal assaults to break enemy lines, penetrating deep into enemy territory. However, especially in the earlier stages of the war, the Soviets were on the defensive and suffered massive casualties. The Red Army was disorganized, especially in areas surrounded by the Wehrmacht, leading to uncoordinated assaults against prepared German positions with limited communications and inexperienced officers and soldiers. Some of those who participated in the assaults were heavy weapon crews who often didn't have a secondary weapon, or NKVD troops armed only with pistols, which gave the impression of charging without weapons in the confusion of battle. These myths entered popular consciousness based on memoirs written after the war and reinforced by Hollywood movies which dramatized the false notion of endless waves of Russians and Soviets hurling themselves at the enemy without weapons. Vietnam. It's all fun and games until the trees start speaking Vietnamese. When French and later American and other allied nations sought influence over the tiny and impoverished nation of Indochina, later called Vietnam, they possessed some of the most advanced weaponry available at the time. Facing them were poorly equipped guerrilla fighters that somehow managed to halt world superpowers. The terrain of Vietnam is filled with dense jungles, rugged mountains, and expansive rice paddies that make travel difficult even under the best of circumstances. The Vietnamese who fought against foreign invaders took full advantage of this, moving quickly and quietly through the wilderness, appearing where they were least expected, striking at their enemies before melting back into the jungle with hardly any trace. Baffled Americans and others would ponderously trample after them without success. Aiding their ability to seemingly disappear into thin air was an extremely elaborate system of tunnels, some of which ran for miles underground and were rumored to be able to withstand direct hits from a B-52 strike. These underground facilities were elaborate, consisting of barracks, medical facilities, weapons storage, and manufacturing locations, and even cinemas and other entertainment venues. The entrances to these tunnels would be well hidden and virtually undetectable. Should they be discovered, collapsing them or stealing them was impossible, as the tunnel system was too extensive to be simply neutralized in this way. The only way to deal with these underground facilities was the unenviable task of tunnel rat, crawling into the dark, unknown spaces with a flashlight and a pistol. The Vietnamese also made extensive use of booby traps, anything from punji pits to impale an unwary soldier's foot to tripwires attached to grenades or other explosives to any number of ingenious devices would force Americans and other enemies into a state of near constant paranoia. In a direct military engagement, Vietnamese forces would almost certainly lose. There was simply no way they could stand up to the massed firepower that can be brought to bear against them by their technologically superior foes. However, they didn't need to win a direct military engagement. Instead, their main focus was on time and morale. With each passing day, more American soldiers would arrive home in coffins or crippled for life, eroding American will to continue the conflict. Even defeats would be turned into victories. In 1968, the Viet Cong and the NVA launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated strike against American and South Vietnamese military installations around the country. The centerpiece of this would be an attack on the embassy in Saigon. Though this attack and the rest of the Tet Offensive was a disaster in military terms, it was ultimately a victory. Seeing the American embassy violated in such a way, along with the daily images of the brutal fighting, sapped the American public's willingness to continue with the conflict. In the end, the Vietnamese did not need to win a military victory, but rather a political one. France. France has an unfortunate and completely false reputation of being a nation of cowards, whose soldiers surrender at the first opportunity. In truth, however, the French have one of the most distinguished records in military history. In the modern day, the French military utilizes the principles of speed, decentralized command, and precision strikes with small numbers of highly motivated troops. This doctrine is in stark contrast to the sledgehammer blows of other major world powers, such as their NATO allies, the United States. This was a deliberate response to the First and Second World Wars, where French troops stood toe-to-toe with their adversaries in direct force engagements, leading to catastrophic casualties. When French territory is potentially threatened, such as during the Cold War, French doctrine centered around the principle that good defense was a strong offense. Knowing that going toe-to-toe against a Warsaw Pact invasion would end in disaster, French planners relied on speed, mobility, and audacity, using aggression and violence of action in blitzkrieg-inspired strikes against the enemy. French sub-commanders were given a great deal of leeway to make decisions, and a culture of audacity of risk-taking was encouraged. This is designed to maintain the ability to act aggressively against threats while also remaining flexible to the ever-changing conditions on the battlefield, without having to ask for permission from a slow-moving chain of command. As a result, the French military prioritized quality over quantity, with a small number of troops able to strike with precision rather than trade blows with the enemy in direct force-on-force engagements, using the minimum amount of force necessary to complete the objective. In one example, in 2007, a large rebel advance in the Central African Republic was stopped in its tracks by around 100 troops and 2 fighter jets. This doctrine is very cost-effective, limiting the amount of resources spent on a particular engagement and reducing the number of potential casualties. By picking their battles and using their existing forces with surgical precision, the French military is able to hit far above its weight class and tie limited numbers to the highest degree possible. When nations go to war, they utilize a multitude of methods to win victory. Whether a stereotype or based in reality, there are as many ways to win as there are nations and cultures on the planet. Imagine opening a box and finding a metal paperclip that remembers its shape, bricks made from the world's most important metals, and games that twist your brain in 6 different directions. Every 3 months, the Curiosity Box delivers a hand-picked collection of science toys, illusions, and books designed to spark wonder and critical thinking. You'll also get illusion stickers, a brain-bending shirt, and a hardcover book called What is Color?, diving deep into one of science's most overlooked mysteries. Each item comes with exclusive video lessons from Michael of Vsauce, content you won't find anywhere else. Click the link now and get 25% off your first box by using our promo code, Simple History. Let your curiosity take over.